For the first time in modern history, Canada isn't building for America. It's building for itself. For generations, Canadian factories forged the backbone of someone else's empire. Pipelines that powered U.S. cities, steel that shaped their skylines, and cars that filled their highways. Our hands built their prosperity, while our own future waited in line. But this week, that era quietly ended. In a calm yet seismic interview, Industry Minister Mélanie Joly announced what could be the most transformative shift in Canada's economic identity in 50 years. A total pivot from producing for the United States to producing for Canadians. No slogans, no drama, just intent. She called it balance. The markets called it a revolution. And behind that calm tone was a message Washington could no longer ignore. Because this isn't just about steel or tariffs, it's about sovereignty, economic, industrial, and psychological. The era of waiting for U.S. demand is over. The era of defining our own has begun. And as America sinks deeper into political volatility, Canada is writing its own playbook, built not on dependency, but direction. This is Northern Pulse. For decades, Canada's industrial heartbeat pulsed to the rhythm of American demand. Hamilton rolled the steel that built Detroit. Alberta pumped the crude that powered Texas. Halifax cut the ships that carried American cargo across the Atlantic. We were the supplier, the subcontractor, the quiet partner whose prosperity hinged on Washington's mood swings. But Mélanie Joly's statement changed that dynamic with 10 calm sentences. No crowd, no flag wave, no chest thump, just clarity. Canada will no longer build its future for someone else. It sounded simple, but it shattered a century-old pattern. For too long, Ottawa had measured success by proximity to the U.S. market. Now it would measure success by domestic strength. Joly called it a declaration of independence. It wasn't the fiery kind written in blood. It was the quiet kind, written in policy, welded in steel. For workers who spent lifetimes producing for foreign demand, it felt personal, a return to purpose. This isn't symbolic, she said. It's survival. And in those words, Canadians heard something new, a promise that this time the factories would hum for them. The catalyst came not from Ottawa, but from Washington. When Donald Trump slapped unpredictable tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum, the ground shifted overnight. Plants built for cross-border trade suddenly faced closed gates. Shipbuilders in Halifax watched orders freeze. Auto suppliers in Ontario saw contracts vanish. Joly's interview didn't bury those memories. It resurrected them. She called the Trump tariffs the moment Canada realized reaction wasn't enough. For years, industries danced around U.S. volatility, praying for exemptions, adapting to every tweet. But one by one, those sectors, steel, lumber, agriculture, stopped waiting for predictability that would never return. Carney's government saw opportunity in the chaos. Rather than plead for access, they built alternatives. Ottawa expanded the Strategic Innovation Fund, redirected billions to domestic infrastructure, and quietly began redesigning factories for Canadian needs. Trump's America First became the spark for Canada's Made at Home. And suddenly, a pattern reversed. Dependency turned to defiance. Tariffs that once looked like punishment became proof of necessity. Canada was done dancing around Washington's whims. It was time to lead its own orchestra. Deep inside Ontario's industrial belt, a quiet transformation is underway. At Algoma Steel in Sault Ste. Marie and ArcelorMittal Dofasco in Hamilton, machines that once stamped auto-grade metal for Detroit are now being reprogrammed to produce the heavy-gauge steel needed for Canadian pipelines and bridges. The old model was simple: serve the U.S. auto market. The new one: build for our own future. Joly explained it bluntly. Our plants were built to feed Detroit, not Toronto. That changes.
Now federal funds are flowing into a national pivot plan, helping companies adapt their production lines to serve domestic projects like the LNG pipeline corridors and the Build Canada Homes program. It's not just an economic shift, it's psychological. For the first time in generations, Canadian workers see their craft feeding their own communities. Each beam, each sheet, each spark represents independence. As Joly put it, every factory that pivots homeward strengthens our shield against foreign volatility. The message is clear. Canada will no longer be a branch plant of someone else's empire. It will be its own engine.
By spring, Joly confirmed, the Buy Canadian Act becomes law. Every major federal project, from housing to shipbuilding, must source Canadian materials and labor by default. No loopholes, no outsourcing excuses. The impact is colossal. For the first time, Canadian manufacturers have guaranteed demand at home. Steel workers in Hamilton, ship engineers in Vancouver, and carpenters in Quebec know their orders won't depend on U.S. politics. A domestic supply chain is replacing a century of cross-border dependency. Even Canada's naval shipyards are part of the revolution. Halifax and Vancouver are building vessels with Canadian steel for the first time in decades. Symbolically, it's seismic. The metal that defends our coasts now comes from our own soil. Behind the policy lies a philosophy: economic sovereignty through production. Every domestic purchase is a vote for independence. Every Buy Canadian contract weakens Washington's grip on our supply chains. This isn't protectionism, it's protection. Critics expected Carney's government to fight Trump with sanctions or statements. Instead, they chose a more elegant weapon: irrelevance. Every time Canada produces its own steel, energy, or infrastructure materials, the U.S. loses leverage. There's no market to threaten, no tariff to dangle. Isolation through irrelevance became the unspoken doctrine. By focusing inward, Canada renders Trump's economic antics obsolete. Washington can't hurt what it no longer controls. And Joly's tone, measured, steady, professional, contrasts sharply with the loud chaos of U.S. politics. Each new local factory contract is a quiet act of rebellion. Each domestic ship launch is a strategic message. We're fine without you. Trump's tariffs once felt like a weapon. Now they look like a mistake that accelerated Canada's rise. By 2026, analysts say, Canada will source over 70% of its industrial inputs domestically, a level of self-sufficiency unseen since World War II. That is Carney's revenge. A prosperous Canada so stable that Washington's storms can't reach it. When reporters asked about Trump's auto tariffs, Joly didn't plead for relief. She reminded Detroit of a debt. In 2008 and 2009, she said, Canadians took stakes in your companies. We saved you with our tax dollars. Now it's time you stand with us. Her words landed like steel on concrete. It wasn't anger, it was accountability. Canadian taxpayers rescued General Motors and Stellantis from collapse. Now those automakers are being asked to invest in Canadian plants and Canadian workers. No more lip service about North American partnerships. Ottawa expects reciprocity. Carney's economic team has made clear Canada will support its auto sector without handshakes from Washington. That means incentives for EV batteries in Ontario, tax credits for domestic assembly, and protection for supply chain workers. The message is firm. Loyalty is earned through investment, not proximity. Even America's auto giants know the math. A stable, resource-rich Canada is safer than a divided U.S. Carney and Joly are betting that Detroit will follow demand north, because that's where the future is being built. Behind Mélanie Joly's confident policy shift stands the quiet architect of Canada's economic transformation, Prime Minister Mark Carney, a man known for precision, not politics. For years, he studied how dependency made Canada vulnerable to the U.S. economic mood swings, and now He's turning that lesson into strategy. Carney's trillion-dollar blueprint isn't a reaction. It's a redesign. It rewires the country's industrial DNA from serving others to sustaining itself. His plan connects every policy, from the Build Canada Homes Initiative to the Green Steel transition and the Buy Canadian Act. Together, they form a single doctrine: prosperity through independence. Carney doesn't chase headlines or trade blows with Trump. He changes the board quietly, piece by piece. When the U.S. imposes tariffs, Carney responds by creating new markets. When Washington tries to weaponize supply chains, he secures new partnerships in Asia and Europe. It's not confrontation, it's calibration. His goal isn't to isolate America, it's to make Canada untouchable. And it's working. Foreign investment is flowing back into Canadian manufacturing. Asian economies are signing multi-billion-dollar import contracts for Canadian minerals and clean energy. Domestic companies are expanding, shielded from foreign shocks. For the first time in decades, Canada's economic growth no longer depends on U.S. permission slips. Carney's strategy is subtle but revolutionary, building strength quietly until it speaks for itself. What Trump misunderstood as defiance was actually design. A nation can only lead when it stops following. And under Carney's steady hand, Canada isn't asking for access anymore. It's setting the terms. Factories, ports, and innovation hubs are no longer signs of survival. They're symbols of sovereignty. This isn't a trade plan. It's a legacy in motion. Critics in Washington call it isolation, but Mark Carney calls it insulation. And that difference defines Canada's new economic era. Isolation is retreating from the world. Insulation is protecting your people from its chaos. Carney's doctrine isn't about closing borders or ending trade. It's about building shock absorbers strong enough to survive global turbulence. When America erupts in tariff wars or political breakdown, Canada doesn't flinch. It stands steady because its future is no longer tied to the next White House mood swing. Mélanie Joly described it perfectly. We're not asking what America wants. We're asking what Canada needs. That one sentence captures the quiet revolution reshaping this country. Canada isn't running away from anyone. It's running toward self-reliance. Each factory expansion, each locally sourced steel contract, each Made in Canada label is another layer of armor. It's the sound of a nation learning to stand tall without leaning on someone else's wall. And the results are visible everywhere. Shipyards in Halifax, housing projects in Alberta, energy grids in British Columbia, all powered by Canadian materials, Canadian labor, and Canadian ambition. The shift isn't loud or flashy. It's measured, confident, unstoppable. Carney and Joly have replaced outrage with outcome. Instead of arguing with Trump, they've made him irrelevant. Because true strength doesn't come from shouting louder. It comes from not needing to shout at all. That's the essence of insulation. Resilience wrapped in quiet confidence. The world is watching a country that no longer begs for access, but builds its own gates. Canada isn't turning its back on America. It's simply walking its own path, one paved with independence, innovation, and intent. And every step forward echoes with a message the world can't ignore. Canada belongs to itself. This moment isn't just a policy shift. It's a national awakening. For more than a century, Canada's growth was measured by how well it served someone else's demand. But now, under Mark Carney and Mélanie Joly, that story is being rewritten in steel, in energy, in pride. The factories that once supplied America are now powering Canada's own rise. The workers who once built foreign dreams are finally building their own. Trump's tariffs were meant to corner Canada. Instead, they carved the path to independence. What began as retaliation has evolved into rebirth. The Buy Canadian Act, the Build Canada Homes Plan, and the Green Steel Revolution are no longer slogans. They're proof that sovereignty isn't just about borders. It's about control. Control over production, pricing, and purpose. Control over destiny. Carney's government has done what few dared. Transform defense into offense without firing a single shot. By making America irrelevant, Canada has made itself essential. And as the global economy fractures between ego and instability, Ottawa stands calm. A country that thrives not because it shouts the loudest, but because it stands the firmest. This is more than economics. It's identity. Canada has rediscovered what it means to belong to itself. Every beam of steel, every ship launched, every worker paid, all whisper the same message. We build for us now. And maybe that's the real legacy of this moment. Not anger, not rivalry, but quiet power. The kind that doesn't fade when headlines do. The kind forged in purpose and pride. Because independence isn't declared. It's built, brick by brick, policy by policy, day by day. This is Northern Pulse, where we don't just report what's happening, we explain why it matters.